7 women, 14 years, almost always the same day of the week. Investigators thought they'd caught him until the confession fell apart, the court set him free, and the real killer simply vanished into the mountains, never to be found. Before we get into this one, tap that subscribe button and drop a like. It's free, it takes 2 seconds, and it helps keep this channel digging up cases like this one. Now, let's begin. In the 1970s, Japan stood balanced between two worlds. On one side, the economy surged forward at breakneck speed, turning the country into one of the engines of global modernity. On the other, its culture remained anchored in rigid tradition, codes of honor, and a proud, almost infallible sense of order. Tokyo stood as the ultimate symbol of post-war reconstruction, its industries booming, its future gleaming with technological promise. But far from the capital, an older Japan persisted. Villages, self-sufficient families, small rural communities holding on to older rhythms of life. In this landscape, between 1970 and 1980, the idea of a serial killer seemed almost unthinkable. In many ways, it felt like an imported American concept, shaped by tabloid headlines from the United States. While Western audiences were already growing familiar with names like Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy, and David Berkowitz, in Japan, the concept had no real place, not in public vocabulary, not in police methodology. If a teenage girl vanished in one town, and months later, a nurse disappeared in another, almost no one would think to connect the two. The official explanation tended to repeat itself: personal choice, or at worst, an isolated tragedy. While American profilers from the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit were gaining fame, rural Japanese investigators still distrusted that kind of psychological approach. Appreciation for the FBI's methods would come eventually, but it would take time. Until then, Japanese policing remained fundamentally practical. Investigators favored long, pressured interrogations, forced confessions, and circumstantial evidence. The goal wasn't to identify patterns or understand a criminal mind. It was to isolate a suspect, secure an admission, and close the case. Violent serial or mass offenders were treated as exceptions, aberrations. Acknowledging predators who killed on impulse rather than necessity meant admitting a deep flaw in the fabric of Japanese society itself. But a killer doesn't answer to convention. While the country exported cutting-edge technology and shaped an increasingly connected society, something else was quietly taking root in the shadows, a space where violent fantasies could grow, unnoticed, in the mind of at least one person. And that's where our story begins. I'm Brian. Welcome back to another episode of Lost Bones. Today we're exploring a curious and largely forgotten criminal case, one where the perpetrator wasn't just an ordinary killer, but a prolific serial murderer who spread terror through rural Japan between 1970 and 1980. One grim detail linked the victims. Nearly all of them vanished on the same day of the week, Wednesday. The small town of Taku, located in Saga Prefecture on the island of Kyushu, is a quiet mountain region known for its hot springs and, above all, for its postcard-perfect landmark, Mount Mifune, home to a garden nearly 200 years old. Every spring, that garden fills with more than 200,000 azaleas blooming at the mountain's base, turning the hillside into a sea of color. And it was here, in this region, that waitress Sumiko Fujita, 48 years old, lived in the late 1980s. She lived with her ailing husband and 2 children. Because of his illness, she worked hard shifts at a local restaurant, from morning until late evening. Around 9 p.m. on Wednesday, July 8, 1987, Sumiko left work with a co-worker to unwind at a local club that served food and karaoke. That night, wanting to blow off steam, she spent about an hour singing and enjoying herself before saying she was heading home. Her co-worker had no idea that would be the last time anyone saw Sumiko alive. Around midnight, Sumiko's husband started to worry. Over the following hours, he called the restaurant where she worked and several co-workers, but no one had any idea where she was. Overcome with worry, he ignored his own illness left the children at home, and walked to the restaurant himself. The place sat just minutes from their home, which only deepened his concern. The walk was short, quick, nothing that should have taken this long. It's worth noting he apparently had no idea his wife had gone to the club after her shift. After searching the area for a while, he returned home and contacted the authorities in Taku. The next morning, police combed the area, questioning neighbors and co-workers. They learned about her visit to the club and that after leaving, Sumiko had passed by a restaurant where another friend worked. That friend invited her to join at the club, but declined herself. Worried about missing the last train home, Sumiko then headed in the opposite direction from the club, likely toward home. At first, officers considered the possibility she'd simply run off, given her situation, caring for 2 children and an ailing husband. But friends and family described her as a hard-working woman who would never abandon her husband or children. The search for leads stretched on for weeks, but no evidence or new witnesses ever surfaced. Aside from the 2 central witnesses, no one had seen or heard anything. Before long, the case was shelved. More than a year later, in the late afternoon of Wednesday, December 7th, 1988, housewife Kiyomi Nakajima, 50 years old, left home to practice volleyball at her town's sports center in Kitagata, a rural area of Saga Prefecture. As she left, one of her daughters saw her wearing an orange sweater, a blue jacket, and dark blue pants, carrying a bag with juice inside. It was a routine sight. Kiyomi was active in the community, especially with the volleyball team, and the sports center sat just minutes from home. Around 10 p.m., when her eldest daughter arrived home, she noticed her mother still hadn't returned. At first, she wasn't overly worried. She remembered Kiyomi mentioning she'd stay at the center after practice to discuss the team's year-end party. A few minutes later, the daughter called some of the volleyball team members and learned that Kiyomi had never actually shown up for practice that night. Hearing this, her concern turned to alarm. Still, nothing was done until her father, Tadao, got home from work and was told what happened. After hearing the details, Tadao walked to the sports center himself, then wandered the streets searching until nearly 2 in the morning, but found no trace of her. The next morning, the Nakajima home was already filled with police officers, interviewing neighbors, friends, and members of the sports center. The search also brought in cadaver dogs, which led the team down a narrow trail near the house, surrounded by trees. Investigators noted the area was naturally quiet, rarely traveled. Kiyomi usually met a neighbor and friend near that same trail, but on the day she disappeared, the neighbor hadn't left her house at all. Around this time, an important witness came forward. In her statement, she said she'd seen a man near the trail, talking with another woman who was holding a bicycle beside her. Search teams looked tirelessly for this woman, but she was never found, described only as someone between 40 and 50, of short stature. As in many cases, investigators began considering the possibility of a planned disappearance, but that theory felt fragile. Kiyomi was a wife, mother, and grandmother, deeply attached to a young grandson. Another important factor, the Nakajima family quickly came across as close-knit, with nothing suggesting an unhappy marriage or troubled home life. According to sources, Tadao and at least one of his daughters worked together at the local post office and were well-liked in the community, a family widely respected for regularly helping their neighbors. A week after the disappearance, Kiyomi's husband, Tadao Nakajima, contacted police, saying he'd received a strange phone call. Fortunately, he'd recorded it and played the tape for investigators. On the recording, an unknown man claims Tadao's wife has been found. Tadao reacts with surprise, asks where, and the man vaguely gestures toward a place called Yakigome, without offering further detail. When Tadao asks who's calling, the man simply replies, "Someone you know," and hangs up. The call caught investigators' attention because the speaker used a dialect common to Saga Prefecture and the Kansai region. Tadao said the voice sounded familiar, but he couldn't place it. The caller was described as possibly in his 40s or 50s. In the days that followed, Tadao received other calls, both at home and at the post office where he worked. These were silent calls, nothing but heavy breathing on the other end. Decades have passed, and the caller was never identified. Investigators, however, believed he was likely a local, since Yakigome wasn't a common name for the area. It was a nickname used only by longtime residents familiar with the mountain region. The search for the suspect grew intense within the community, but led nowhere, and over time, the case, too, was shelved. Up to this point, none of these cases had drawn official attention to a possible connection between them, largely because they were being investigated by different police stations that didn't even share information. That changed about a month later, on Wednesday, January 25th, 1989, when a new disappearance was reported. Secretary Tatsuyo Yoshino, 37, lived in the Kitamachi area near Kitagata. At the time, she lived with her parents and a young son, a fourth grader. She'd recently divorced and was supporting herself on a secretary's salary at a local sewing company. On the Wednesday, she disappeared. She came home from work and went straight to help her mother prepare dinner, still in her work uniform. At 7:25 p.m., she answered a phone call that, according to her family, lasted only a few seconds. Afterward, she hung up, took a bath, and changed into a skirt and white cardigan. Before heading out, she told her family a friend's car had a flat tire and she was going to help him. She then left, driving her red Isuzu. A few hours later, her parents realized she should have been back by then and called the police. The next morning, the search began around 7 a.m. Before long, Tatsuyo's car was located in the parking lot of Takuo Bowling, a bowling alley 4 kilometers from her family's home. The car was locked, with no obvious leads or anything out of place. Following the discovery, investigators questioned local residents and bowling alley staff, but no one had seen anything. A secretary from a nearby office, however, came forward. In her statement, she said she'd seen Tatsuyo willingly get into the passenger seat of a white Toyota Cresta. According to the witness, Tatsuyo seemed to have stopped and waited for the car to arrive and pick her up. Investigators found that only around 130 people in the region owned that particular model at the time. A massive search followed, but no owner of a white Toyota Cresta was ever arrested or singled out as a likely suspect. It's possible the witness misidentified the model, or that the suspect simply wasn't from the area. Meanwhile, more witnesses came forward claiming to have seen Tatsuyo standing near her car in the bowling alley lot. At first, the case looked like an affair gone wrong, a woman running off with a lover. 2 days later, a sign of something far larger and more tragic emerged. Nearly at the end of the afternoon, around 6 p.m., a couple in their 60s were driving through the mountainous roads north of Kitagata. Along the way, they decided to stop and pick a flower to offer at a Buddhist altar they knew well. The husband parked the car, and his wife walked to the edge of the road. While picking the flower, she noticed, in the distance, a cliff with a small embankment below, and something white that caught her eye. She stepped forward as far as she safely could, and saw something horrifying. The white object was, in fact, the nude body of a woman. Beside, it appeared to be 2 more bodies. The couple immediately called the authorities, who arrived within minutes and sealed off the area. News spread fast, and authorities already suspected who the victims might be. The first body was identified as Kiyomi Nakajima, missing since the previous November. The upper half of her body badly decomposed, nearly skeletal. About a meter away lay a second body, already skeletal, identified as Sumiko Fujita, missing for almost 2 years. And finally, 2 meters from Kiyomi lay the body of Secretary Tatsuyo Yoshino, missing only a few days. At the scene, authorities found a disturbing setup. The killer had stripped the victims' clothing, including their underwear, and hung it from nearby tree branches. Field analysis showed the killer had cleared a path through the brush, creating a makeshift trail. The prevailing theory? The first victim had ended up there by chance, while the other 2 were brought once the trail was already carved. This was the killer's own private cemetery. Taken to autopsy, the bodies of Tatsuyo Yoshino and Kiyomi Nakajima showed signs of death by strangulation. Kiyomi's stomach contained the exact meal her family reported she'd eaten before leaving for volleyball practice, meaning she was killed almost immediately after being taken. Tatsuyo's body, more recently deceased and relatively fresh, was sent for analysis to Saga University, where examiners and students determined she died roughly an hour after eating dinner. They also found marks on her face and nose suggesting the killer had held her down while strangling her, which briefly led investigators to consider the possibility of two attackers, one strangling while the other restrained her, covering her nose and mouth. That theory didn't last long, though. It was soon ruled out. Although the body had been found quickly, no DNA or fibers turned up on it. The clothing told a different story. On one item, investigators found small traces of saliva belonging to a single, unidentified person. The samples were isolated and sent for testing. Meanwhile, Tatsuyo's handbag was handed over to investigators, discovered a day before the bodies were found, in an area near the killer's makeshift cemetery. Inside were her cards, cash, a bank book seal, and makeup. Other personal items belonging to her later turned up scattered across other parts of the city. The killer seemed to have deliberately discarded her belongings in easy-to-find locations. Police hoped these items might offer DNA evidence, but nothing ever turned up. In the weeks that followed, the investigation into the three women's deaths intensified and drew together several jurisdictions. This led to the discovery of a new witness, who reported seeing a white van belonging to a fishing company parked in the bowling alley lot the night Tatsuyo disappeared. The witness described a decal on the windshield featuring fish scales, something that had caught her eye. She'd wanted to speak to the owner to get one like it, but never found him. Following this lead, investigators tracked down a casual romantic partner of Tatsuyo's, the van's owner, Teruo Matsue, 26 years old. He was questioned extensively, but nothing came of it. After his release, Teruo quit his job in the city and moved away, a move that didn't go unnoticed. In mid-November of that year, he resurfaced on investigators' radar after being arrested and convicted for theft and drug trafficking. Questioned again, this time far more intensely, he confessed to all three murders within days. Saga Prefecture authorities went further, linking Teruo to 4 additional archived homicides dating from 1975 to 1982. The prosecution announced they would push for the death penalty. The reason? Those 4 murders formed part of a killing sequence attributed to an unidentified serial killer active in Saga Prefecture, a figure known infamously as the Wednesday Strangler. The connection surfaced once investigators noticed that Sumiko, Kiyomi, and Tatsuyo had all disappeared on a Wednesday. It seemed like the perfect conclusion. The killer finally caught. Justice finally within reach. But to understand why authorities were so confident about Teruo Matsue's involvement in all these deaths, we need to go back to where it all began. This case's story begins in mid-1975 with 12-year-old Tomiko Yamazaki. At the time, she lived with her mother in Kitagata, Saga Prefecture. Tomiko was described as bright, happy, and mature for her age. The only real strain in her life came from financial hardship. Her mother worked late shifts at a local club to make ends meet. To avoid leaving Tomiko home alone, her mother would pick her up after school and bring her to the club, where the girl waited in the staff break room, spending hours drawing and doing homework. Tomiko rarely stayed home by herself, except during summer break, when school was closed and her mother couldn't keep her close all day. During those stretches, the girl had to spend a few hours alone at home. That's how Tomiko came to be seen for the last time on Wednesday, August 27th, 1975. Her mother left for work around 4 p.m., and before heading out, saw her daughter inviting a neighbor over to play. She left for her shift with peace of mind, confident Tomiko would have company for a few hours. But when she came home after midnight, she found something strange. Most of the lights in the house were on. The TV was running, yet the house itself was silent. She went to her daughter's room and found nothing. At first, she thought Tomiko might have gone out, but that idea fell apart when she noticed two troubling details. Tomiko's shoes were still by the front door, and her skirt lay discarded on the bathroom floor. Kitagata authorities were called. The first officers on scene logged the case and searched the house. No signs of forced entry, no break-in, nothing stolen. Aside from the skirt in the bathroom, everything looked ordinary. The possibility of a runaway gained traction among police. But to her mother, that idea seemed absurd. Her daughter was shy, not someone who'd make such a drastic decision. What sealed the case against that theory was the shoes at the door and clothes left in her room. Items she surely would have taken if she'd planned to run. In the days that followed, searches covered the entire region without success. The only witness was the neighbor, who said she'd played with Tomiko until around 7 p.m., then gone home. She hadn't seen or heard anything unusual. The prevailing theory became that sometime after that hour, someone had entered the house, found Tomiko in the bathroom, and possibly abducted her. The truth about what happened to her would remain unknown for 5 years, until a new disappearance surfaced. The second victim was nurse and waitress Hitsuko Ryakutaki, 19 years old, who lived with her family in Shiroishi, Saga Prefecture. Hitsuko was a dedicated young woman. She'd left home early to study nursing in Amagasaki, in Hyogo Prefecture. In March 1997, she returned to her hometown and continued her studies while working a shift at a local cafe. That job didn't last long. She soon moved to Osaka. By mid-1979, Hitsuko returned to Shiroishi after her mother fell ill. As a nursing student, she chose to change her plans, moving back in to help care for her mother and support her father and sisters. She returned to her old cafe job and also picked up a position at a local hospital. Between the two jobs, she had plenty of friendships, and people described her as serious, someone who worked harder than necessary to support her family. Those same people also described her as a somewhat sad young woman. During her time at the cafe, she often called an unidentified man, supposedly around 24. No one knew exactly who he was, but she seemed deeply involved with him, someone who often left her upset. It later came out that Hitsuko had tried to end the relationship at least twice, and her frustration seemed to spill over into overwork. Friends and coworkers said she often refused time off and always seemed preoccupied. One friend recalled that when discussing a wedding gift for another friend, Hitsuko simply said she didn't have time to think about it, a small sign of the emotional distance growing around her. Against this backdrop, we arrive at Saturday, April 12th, 1980. That day, her father was hospitalized after a minor accident, and her mother stayed with him at the hospital. Hitsuko was left alone at home. Her older sister had gone to a friend's house, her younger sister was studying at a classmate's, and her brother was at work. Following the same pattern as Tomiko Yamazaki's case, when family members returned home, they found no sign of Hitsuko. Authorities were called immediately. No signs of a struggle. Her shoes sat by the front door, suggesting she hadn't left the house. The only clue was her missing pajamas. Police concluded she'd likely already changed for bed when she vanished. In the days that followed, the theory of a deliberate disappearance gained traction after investigators learned that 2 weeks earlier, Hitsuko had traveled somewhere with a man. Neither this man nor her 24-year-old suitor was ever identified, and it's unclear whether they were the same person. Days after her disappearance, the Ryakutaki family received a letter. Its full contents were never made public, though one line was later shared. The writer claimed that Hitsuko won't be coming back and that he wanted to see the family suffer. Forensic analysis of the letter revealed it had been written using old-style kana spelling. After World War II, Japan underwent an orthographic reform in 1946 that modernized kana writing and replaced the older historical forms. The use of outdated spellings suggested something about the writer, possibly someone older or with a higher level of education. Beyond the letter, the family also received phone calls ordering them not to report the disappearance to the press. It's unclear why, but the family described the caller as sounding young. There may be some translation ambiguity here, so it's more likely the description referred to the perceived age based on the voice itself. Around this time, investigators believed they'd identified the 24-year-old man Hitsuko had been talking to on the phone. Following these leads, they concluded it was the boyfriend of Hitsuko's older sister, recorded only as Yu, then 29 years old. This line of investigation grew out of rumors about a supposed love triangle, and Yu became a person of interest, partly because he frequently visited the cafe where Hitsuko worked. Questioned about the night of her disappearance, he claimed he'd been drinking at a local bar and only returned home early the next morning. Hitsuko's parents told police Yu was troublesome and held a grudge against them for opposing his relationship with their eldest daughter. The motivation seemed straightforward. Yu was 29, unemployed, and generally seen as having poor character. During the investigation, police learned that shortly after Hitsuko disappeared, Yu did something unusual. He went to a local newspaper and asked that the disappearance not be reported. A few hours later, he returned and asked for the story to be published after all. Investigators tried to confirm his alibi at the bar, but couldn't. Questioned directly, he firmly denied any involvement and didn't crack under pressure. With nothing solid to justify an arrest, the investigation's assessment was that Yu looked more like an opportunistic, poorly behaved man manipulating the feelings of both sisters than a genuine suspect in the disappearance. Before this theory could be explored further, a disturbing discovery emerged. In the late afternoon of June 24, 1980, more than 2 months after Hitsuko vanished, police were called to Suko Elementary School in Shiroishi. Sanitation workers hired to drain the septic tank at the north restroom reported a grim find. Opening the manhole to begin cleanup, they spotted a nude body floating inside. The body was in advanced decomposition. Fingerprint analysis identified it as Hitsuko Ryakutaki. Bruising and compression marks on the neck confirmed the cause of death as manual strangulation. The body was sent to Kurume University, where examiners concluded she'd been killed the same day she disappeared. Investigators believed the murder had taken place elsewhere and that the body was later disposed of in the tank. In the days that followed, the tank itself was thoroughly searched. Forensic teams recovered several items: socks, a syringe, a sandal, and a child's slipper. The mystery deepened after interviews with every worker at the sanitation company, along with school staff and students. Investigators confirmed the manhole had been drained just days after Hitsuko's disappearance, meaning the killer had kept her body for several days before disposing of it. In interviews, some students mentioned that a few days before the body was found, tufts of hair had turned up around a toilet in the north restroom. According to sources, samples of that hair were collected and sent for analysis, confirming they belonged to Hitsuko. During a thorough search for evidence across the school, forensic teams also found a small blood stain in the men's pool locker room, an area that typically stayed closed until summer. Investigators theorized Hitsuko may have been abducted and taken to the locker room, where she was killed and her body kept hidden. Days later, with summer arriving and the septic system due for its usual cleaning, the killer may have seen it as the perfect opportunity to dispose of her remains in the tank. The investigation seemed to be gaining real momentum, and the school itself increasingly looked like a site rich with evidence. That impression grew stronger days later, when the school's vice principal came forward with a troubling account. According to him, before Hitsuko's body was found, he'd requested the same sanitation company drain the septic tank near the pool restrooms as well, but they were unable to complete the job. When they opened that tank, they found it blocked with rocks. The issue was set aside to deal with later, then forgotten entirely once Hitsuko's body was discovered. Hearing this, authorities called in the police's technical team, who cleared away the rocks and, before long, spotted a skeletal human body along with children's clothing. Once recovered, the remains were determined to belong to an adolescent. Investigators cross-referenced archived missing persons cases from the region and landed on the name Tomiko Yamazaki, 12, missing for 5 years. When Tomiko's mother came forward, She identified her daughter's remains without hesitation, recognizing the clothing and strands of hair. The remains were sent to Kurume University for analysis. Due to the advanced state of decomposition, the exact cause of death couldn't be determined. Given the circumstances and the absence of bone damage or bloodstains on the clothing, it was likely that Tomiko, too, had been strangled. Authorities questioned the school's administration, arguing Tomiko's remains should have been discovered far sooner. In response, the school explained that particular septic tank hadn't been regularly drained because students didn't use that restroom, and because it sat in a spot difficult for sanitation trucks to reach. Given the nature of these discoveries, investigators concluded the crimes were sexually motivated. While sources don't specify the presence or absence of sexual violence, a detail commonly withheld in Japanese cases at the time by police and press, it's likely this information was deliberately held back. Both cases were investigated intensively and linked together. The killer had operated unpunished for 5 years and had claimed a new victim, following the same modus operandi and signature. This was, without question, a serial killer. Around this same time, Yu, the boyfriend of Hitsuko's older sister, resurfaced as a person of interest after being accused of assaulting a co-worker at the factory where he worked. Real interest sparked when investigators checked his address and found he lived just a few meters from Suko Elementary School, where the bodies were discovered. Given the coincidence, investigators looked into whether he might have known Tomiko Yamazaki. To their surprise, they discovered Yu was a regular customer at the club where Tomiko's mother worked. According to the investigation, he knew the girl and had spoken with her on occasions when she accompanied her mother to work. They also noted that his visits to the club increased after Tomiko disappeared. Sometime after her daughter's disappearance, Tomiko's mother moved to the prefectural capital of Saga. Once again, to investigators' surprise, Yu turned up occasionally at her new workplace, always presenting himself as a family friend. Yu was far from an upstanding figure. According to sources, a check into his criminal history revealed that, as a young man, he'd been arrested as part of a gang that assaulted and robbed women. So Yu was, by all accounts, a violent man who seemed to know the streets, homes, and families of the small communities of Shiroishi and Kitagata intimately. When these findings were presented to him, Yu denied any involvement. Even so, his home was searched, and investigators found stationery matching the letters sent to the Ryakutaki family after Hitsuko's disappearance. His handwriting was also compared and showed some similarities. Investigators had plenty to work with, but the problem was that the evidence remained purely circumstantial, much of it built from rumor. Digging into these findings, it becomes clear that much of what surfaced about Yu came from people who never became formal witnesses. Individuals who were simply questioned and shared information or alleged sightings without ever being called to testify. How was this allowed to happen? We don't know. In older cases like this kind of loose, underdeveloped police work isn't surprising. Without physical or DNA evidence tying Yu to the crimes, investigators were forced to abandon that line of inquiry. More than a year passed without answers, until a new disappearance was reported. The third victim was seamstress Shizuko Ikami, 27, living in the Shiroishi area. Little is known about her. As far as records show, Shizuko worked at a company that sewed men's clothing. At the time, she was married and led an ordinary routine. She was last seen alive on Wednesday, October 7th, 1981, after leaving work at 5:30 p.m. Her absence was quickly noticed by her husband, who called the authorities. The next morning, police received a call from her employer reporting she hadn't shown up for work, and given recent events, they feared she might be a new victim. Investigators quickly began interviewing people and learned that after leaving work, Shizuko had been seen at a supermarket near her workplace. She appeared to shop normally and leave the store without incident. That account changed, though, when a witness said she'd seen Shizuko talking with a man in the supermarket parking lot. He was described as at least 30 years old, driving a reddish-brown car. The investigation also revealed Shizuko had been absent from work for 4 days straight, only showing up on the day she disappeared. When questioned, her co-workers said she'd told them her mother was ill. Her husband dismissed that explanation, raising the possibility she was involved with another man. 2 weeks later, also on a Wednesday, investigators were caught off guard. Shizuko's body was found in a vacant lot in the neighboring town of Nabari, in Saga Prefecture, nearly 40 kilometers from the supermarket where she'd last been seen. When found, she was still wearing her work clothes. The location was described as difficult to access. The cause of death was listed as strangulation, this time carried out with an electrical cord. Unlike the previous victims, Shizuko showed no signs of sexual assault. Even so, public opinion quickly linked her death to the other cases, largely because she too had disappeared on a Wednesday. Fear began to settle over the city of Shiroishi. Facing rumors of a serial killer, investigators still lacked meaningful evidence. Child welfare organizations raised concerns with authorities, warning of the danger this criminal posed to Shiroishi's children. And they were right. Someone very dangerous remained at large, with no clear pattern to their victims. Children were not safe, and before long, that would prove tragically true. We arrive at Wednesday, February 17th, 1982, in the town of Kitashigi, Saga Prefecture. The final victim's name was never publicly released, but sources say she was called Kumi, and that's how she's typically referred to in accounts of this case. So, for clarity, we'll use that name here too. At the time of her disappearance and later death, Kumi was 11 years old, a 5th grader at Kitashigi Elementary School. She was last seen leaving home and walking towards school, less than half a kilometer away. By nightfall, her family, already unsettled by rumors of the killings, grew alarmed at her absence. Authorities were called and quickly began searching, realizing Kumi had vanished near the same area where Shizuko's body had been found. The only witness was a friend who'd walked with her at the start of the trip to school before splitting off shortly after. The search for the girl kept Kitashigi authorities working through the night, aided by the fire department. With a large search team mobilized, it was only a matter of time before Kumi was found. But by then, it was already too late. In the early hours of the following day, the girl's body was found behind a tangerine orchard, north of Kitaso Junior High School's gymnasium, less than 2 kilometers from where Shizuko had been discovered. She lay face down, undressed from the waist down, with signs of sexual assault. She had been strangled with her own socks. Later analysis determined Kumi had been killed just 10 minutes after she was last seen, alive. Authorities immediately connected all 4 cases and launched a massive information-gathering operation. Pressure across the affected communities led to a significant discovery. According to most witnesses, an unfamiliar man in his 30s had been seen repeatedly along National Route 34. One witness, a housewife in her early 30s, said a man matching that description approached her in a white car and asked if she'd like a ride home. She described him as somewhere between 30 and 40, with a thin face, a long nose, and distinctive features. She said she declined the ride, that he insisted, and only backed off when she threatened to call the police, at which point, she said, he grimaced and drove off quickly. Her account matched another sighting from a different witness, who described seeing an unfamiliar man in a white car parked near a school. According to that person, the man approached a student and tried to lead her toward the girl's restroom. The student screamed as they got close, and the man fled. Another sighting, possibly of the same individual, occurred later near the school Kumi attended. 2 students said the man tried to get them into his car, a white vehicle, but they refused, and he sped off. He returned later and tried approaching other girls, again without success. The timing of these accounts lined up closely with when Kumi had left for school that morning, suggesting this man could well be her killer. As the investigation advanced, authorities began to believe the suspect's car might be a Toyota Corolla, a Toyota Sprinter, or a Daihatsu, based on the large number of witnesses. Investigators even pieced together a partial license plate, tracing it to the city of Fukuoka, in the prefecture of the same name. With this information, a composite sketch of the suspect was created and distributed throughout Saga and Fukuoka. A massive manhunt began. Authorities on each case remained hopeful they'd finally track down a viable suspect, but it never happened. It's possible the release of the sketch spooked him, driving him to retreat from the area and avoid drawing further attention. More than 5 years passed without a single similar case, until the disappearance of the very first victim mentioned at the start of this episode, 48-year-old Sumiko Fujita, on Wednesday, July 8, 1987, brought this old evil roaring back into Saga Prefecture. That became even clearer with the subsequent disappearances of Kiyomi Nakajima and Tatsuyo Yoshino, both also on Wednesdays. To the authorities, he had returned. The suspect known as Yu would soon have his real name revealed. Teruo Matsue. Real progress in the investigation came in early February 1989, when the National Police Agency began reacting sharply to what was unfolding in rural Saga Prefecture. The death toll among women had already reached 7, counting the teenage victims. Investigators had no evidence, no real leads, so the agency dispatched a senior investigator to take charge. On the ground, this officer found a chaotic situation. Residents distrusted the police's work and openly mocked their lack of progress. Most families kept to themselves, trusting only each other and the rumors circulating locally. This made investigating extremely difficult and revealed just how much the local force lacked direction and control. It became clear the officers in charge were falling short, damaging the broader reputation of Japanese policing. The Kitagata, Shiroishi, and surrounding areas fell far below the standards seen elsewhere in the country. But the obstacles went beyond simple incompetence. According to sources, misinformation saturated these communities and muddied the investigation at every turn. Many key witnesses avoided speaking to authorities, afraid of being cut off from local social circles built on trust. In this climate of rumor, some genuinely useful information got treated with too little attention. For instance, Tatsuyo Yoshino, killed in January 1989, worked at the same company as Shizuko Ikami, killed in October 1981. Sumiko Fujita's niece, Sumiko, killed in July 1987, and Kiyomi Nakajima's daughter, Kiyomi, killed in December 1988, had also worked at that very same company. At first glance, the company looked like a promising lead, possibly connected to the killer himself. There was a real chance he knew the victims and understood their routines. But this information circulated more through community gossip than through official investigative channels, and the lead fizzled out, never firmly establishing a real connection between the cases. Given this climate, few people agreed to talk to investigators. Reports surfaced about the involvement of Yu, Hitsuko Ryakutaki's sister's boyfriend, and about Teruo Matsue, Tatsuyo Yoshino's lover. Suspicion around Yu faded as the work progressed. With Teruo, the opposite happened. Suspicion only grew stronger, since the evidence felt more solid. Of course, it's a bit confusing, but we're talking about the same man here. Investigators found Teruo had a record of theft charges. Witnesses close to him reported that he and Tatsuyo met in secret. She'd drive to a designated spot, meet him, and the two would go to a hotel within the very area where the bodies were later found. The Yoshino family denied knowing about the relationship. At first, the story sounded like mere rumor, but Tatsuyo's younger sister, once she learned about the affair between her sister and Teruo Matsue, also revealed that Tatsuyo had been afraid to rekindle the relationship, saying he'd once threatened, during an argument, to throw her off a cliff. At the time of the murder, they weren't together, but Teruo reportedly called her home repeatedly. As mentioned at the start of this episode, this body of evidence led to his interrogation. Faced with the evidence, he confessed not just to Tatsuyo's murder, but also to those of Sumiko Fujita and Kiyomi Nakajima. In his confession, he claimed that on the night of the murder, he'd called Tatsuyo and arranged to meet her. After picking her up at the bowling alley parking lot, he said something snapped and he strangled her to death. He claimed jealousy drove the attack. a belief that she was seeing another man. Afterward, he said, he carried her body to the mountainous region outside town and left her in his private cemetery, where the bodies of Sumiko and Kiyomi already lay. As for the other two victims, he said he followed the same pattern. With Sumiko, he claimed he found her on the street after she left the club and invited her into his car. Since she knew him, she got in without resistance. With Kiyomi, he said he nearly hit her with his car while driving drunk, and fearing she'd go to the police, decided to kill her. Despite the confession secured by Saga Prefecture police, the whole case collapsed when Teruo Matsue recanted, denying any involvement in the murders. The big move seemed calculated. He knew authorities lacked enough physical evidence to hold up in court. In the end, all they had was the confession itself, with nothing solid backing it up. Teruo's retraction left authorities with their hands tied. After his release, he gave an interview to Kyoto News, saying he'd known Tatsuyo Yoshino, but had never been intimately involved with her, and that he had no knowledge of the other victims. Though police searched for evidence to support the original confession, the lack of physical proof forced investigators to abandon any case against him. Believe it or not, more than a decade would pass until the mid-2000s, when new cold case investigators decided to reopen the Kitagata case. Using new technology, the team submitted the only genetic material they had for testing: saliva samples recovered from Tatsuyo Yoshino's body. They ran a DNA comparison against Teruo, the prime suspect. According to sources, the match tied him directly to the murder. At the time, collecting his DNA proved simple, since Teruo had been arrested that same year in connection with a string of home invasions in neighboring Kagoshima Prefecture. In July 2002, he was also connected to the murder of Sumiko Fujita, the charge filed with just 6 hours remaining before the statute of limitations expired. Days later, Teruo was charged with Kiyomi Nakajima's murder as well, and suspicions arose linking him to some of the killings attributed to the Wednesday Strangler. The suspect maintained his innocence, and his lawyers challenged the evidence presented by prosecutors. At trial, the prosecution presented the 1989 confession, the DNA test results, and a photograph found in Teruo's vehicle, allegedly containing DNA from one of the victims. The defense argued the confession had been coerced, and that the DNA tests were unreliable, based on a sample too small to produce trustworthy results. They also claimed investigators had ignored evidence pointing to another possible suspect, suppressing forensic material relevant to the case in order to build a narrative that pinned everything solely on Teruo Matsue. The trial dragged on until 2005, when the Saga District Court acquitted him. According to the court, the defendant's confession couldn't be accepted as evidence, since it had been obtained illegally. The remaining evidence was ruled insufficient to conclude the defendant was truly guilty. Prosecutors pushed back, insisting the confession should stand as evidence and urging the court to give greater weight to the DNA findings they claimed had been dismissed too easily. The case dragged on for several more years, until the Fukuoka High Court upheld Teruo's acquittal. In the words of presiding Judge Katsuhiko Masaki, the defendant had been subjected to illegally prolonged interrogation that went well beyond what could be considered voluntary, and there was a real possibility investigators had pressured him into confessing. The Saga District Court ultimately awarded Teruo roughly 5,800,000 yen in compensation for the damages caused by the accusations against him. Had the prosecution succeeded, Teruo would have faced the death penalty, underscoring just how much was at stake for him in the hands of the justice system. It's also worth noting the Kitagata case was reopened remarkably close to the statute of limitations deadline, raising the possibility of an internal strategy to close out a high-profile case using manipulated evidence against the one existing suspect, a man with a troubled profile that made him easy to link to the crimes, and with a genuine connection to one of the victims. In the end, Teruo was also completely cleared of any suspected involvement in the Wednesday Strangler murders. From the very start, There was no real basis for the prosecution to connect him to the earlier serial killings. First, because Teruo simply doesn't fit the timeline of events. If he'd been involved in the first murder in 1975, when 12-year-old Tomiko Yamazaki was abducted from her own home, that would mean he began his killing spree at 11 or 12 years old. He would then have gone quiet for 6 years, returning at 17 to kill 19-year-old Hitsuko Ryakutaki, also abducted from her home, before continuing on to murder 27-year-old Shizuko Ikami and 11-year-old Kumi. While the idea of a child or teenage killer isn't impossible in theory, in this specific case, Teruo's profile simply doesn't hold up. That leaves a significant void in the case. Who, then, could the real killer have been? Looking closely at the details, a few conclusions emerge. The victims had wildly different profiles: teenagers, young single women, married women, and grandmothers. The common thread is that most disappeared on a Wednesday, with one exception: Hitsuko Ryakutaki, killed on a Saturday. Serial killers often operate around psychological anchors, markers of power or control. In this case, the perpetrators seem to have a strong attachment to Wednesdays, almost as if that day of the week heightened his homicidal compulsion. But it could just as easily have been something practical: a day off work, or simply a day he could act without drawing attention. Either way, the method itself remained more consistent than the choice of day, and that operational coherence supports the theory of a single perpetrator working under repeated patterns. In every case, the killer abducted his victims during moments of vulnerability, walking home from work, on the way to school, or even inside their own homes. One detail stands out. Looking at the abductions that occurred inside the victims' own homes, we see they were alone at the time. True for 12-year-old Tomiko Yamazaki, and true as well for Hitsuko Ryakutaki, taken on a Saturday, which raises the theory that the killer abandoned his usual Wednesday ritual because he knew that Saturday was the only day he'd find her alone. Does that make sense? Maybe. It's also possible Wednesdays simply became a way of taunting the authorities, as if he were saying, "You know when I'm going to strike, but you still can't stop me." As for his signature, strangulation sat at the very core of this case, an intimate method that demands close physical contact and reflects a desire for complete domination. The scenes left behind after each killing reinforce that reading. In the final 3 murders, the victim's underwear was removed and hung from nearby tree branches, turning the site into a kind of macabre shrine. Personal belongings were also scattered across different parts of the city, as if the killer wanted to provoke the authorities directly. This kind of theatricality is typical of ritualistic killers, for whom the act doesn't end with the death itself. It extends into the staging and into the psychological aftershock delivered through letters and phone calls. What emerges then is the profile of a sadistic, controlling, ritualistic man, likely methodical by nature. He was probably between 20 and 30 years old during the earliest crimes, committed between 1975 and 1982, and between 30 and 40 during the 1987 to 1989 cases. He likely lived in Saga Prefecture, given his familiarity with local dialects and the routes he used, and appeared to rely frequently on National Route 34, which connected much of the area where the disappearances occurred. He was clever enough to avoid getting caught in the act, but likely carried a history of juvenile delinquency or minor offenses before escalating to murder. Looking at victimology, there's no single physical profile among the victims: girls, young women, and mature women alike. This suggests his motivation wasn't tied to age or appearance, but to opportunity and circumstance. What drove him was the chance to exercise absolute power. This connects to another detail. All the victims were, in some way, linked to the Easto Home, same sewing company. The picture that emerges points to someone with a history of violence and arrests, yet socially integrated enough to hold a job and move freely through schools, clubs, and streets without raising suspicion. Perhaps he was one of those handyman-type workers, common in schools and businesses throughout the 1980s and 90s. It's possible he spent long stretches watching his victims, studying their routines, exploiting weaknesses with an unusual level of care. His apparent compulsion to prolong the family's suffering, and his attempt to present himself as cultured or intelligent through his letters, points to a deep need to feel superior, reinforcing the idea he may have held a simple, unremarkable job that let him move through the world unnoticed. In the end, the Wednesday Strangler fits within the category of compulsive, ritualistic killers, criminals who build patterns that turn murder into a kind of personal liturgy. He stopped killing once a suspect. Teruo Matsue was arrested. Why did he stop? There are several theories. First, though Teruo wasn't the true killer behind the earlier victims, his arrest may have alerted the real perpetrator to mounting police pressure, prompting him to halt. Second, the sense of victory a ritualistic killer might feel, watching police and press point to someone else entirely, could have served as a kind of final reward in itself. A third theory centers on unforeseen change. Long dormant periods were already a fixture of his criminal life, so it's possible he simply chose to stop, or fell ill, or died sometime after 1989. Finally, the most widely accepted theory: there were two different perpetrators. Several sources argue the murders from 1975 to 1982, and those from 1987 to 1989 couldn't have been committed by the same person. The Kitagata case might instead have been the work of a copycat, someone who knew the details of the earlier killings and chose to imitate the pattern, even going so far as to kill people connected to the same company, driven by his own obsessive criminal compulsion. Various theories remain about the identity of the killer or killers, but it's entirely plausible the case suffered from genuine police incompetence and that the real perpetrator remained, the entire time, remarkably close to being identified. Saga Prefecture police faced heavy criticism at the time for their handling of both the Wednesday Strangler case and the final 3 murders. Today, every one of these cases has passed the statute of limitations, and no one is actively investigating them any longer. It's entirely possible they'll never see resolution. Like so many serial killers before him, this one may simply remain another name on the long list of the never identified. Finally, according to one of the sources used for this episode, a kind of makeshift shrine has been erected near the site at the base of the mountain where the last 3 victims were found. We couldn't determine when it was built, but everything suggests it's relatively recent. Whoever built it remains unknown. Some say it was the real killer himself, now an old man. Others believe it was longtime residents of the area. Whatever the truth, it's all that remains of a tragic, morbid case, one that never found justice and never will.